Here, every past life feels real.
How empires die. The beginning of Rome's end. Rome at the height of its power. AD 117, Trajan returns from Dacia. Thousands of captives walk behind his chariot. Ahead lie years of triumph. Behind him, the most profitable war in the history of the empire. Dacian gold filled the treasury so completely that Trajan staged games lasting 123 consecutive days. Rome now controlled a territory stretching from the marshes of Scotland to the Persian frontier. Roughly a quarter of humanity lived under its rule. This was the peak. But a peak is not a plateau. It is the point after which movement changes direction. And in AD 117, that change had already begun. No one yet knew what to call it. What made Rome so durable for so many centuries? Not the charisma of individual emperors and not luck in isolated battles. It was institutional momentum. The Republic had built a system in which power was distributed, bureaucracy functioned, and the army remained under civil control. The empire inherited those structures and at first strengthened them. Roads on which one could travel from Londinium to Antioch, aqueducts that supplied cities of hundreds of thousands with fresh water, a unified legal system operating from Morocco to Mesopotamia. It was not a perfect state, but it was a state that knew how to solve problems. The Romans called the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, our sea. This was not metaphor, it was literal reality. Pirates had been crushed as early as Pompeii. Trade routes functioned without interruption. Grain from North Africa fed a Rome of 1 million inhabitants. Silk from China, moving through intermediaries, reached Roman markets. Europe would not see that level of economic integration again for another 1,500 years. The system was vast, complex, and outwardly monolithic. And yet, cracks were already lodged inside that monolith. The economy depended on slave labor. Slaves came from war. War brought new territory. Territory required more legions. Legions required money. It was a closed circle that worked only on one condition: continuous expansion. By conquering Dacia and trying to secure Mesopotamia, Trajan reached the literal limit of that expansion. His successor, Hadrian, withdrew and began building walls, actual walls. Hadrian's wall in Britain was not a symbol of strength. It was a signed admission that there was nowhere left to go. A machine built for expansion had stopped, and for that kind of machine, stopping is not a pause. It is the beginning of a different process. At the height of its power, Rome was a system whose stability rested not on the absence of problems, but on its ability to absorb them. As long as that capacity remained intact, the empire held. Once it began to erode, everything started moving in the opposite direction. But before that happened, Rome had to pass through one more phase, the phase in which Romans convinced themselves completely that nothing like collapse could ever happen to them. The illusion of eternity. The Romans did not simply live in an empire, they lived inside the conviction that the empire was the natural order of things, not one possible form of government, not a historical construction shaped by circumstance, something closer to a law of nature. Virgil put this belief into the mouth of Jupiter himself. Rome had been granted rule without limit and without end. Imperium sine fine. That was not poetic license, it was state ideology, repeated in schools, carved into triumphal arches, and stamped onto coins. Architecture served the same purpose and did so more effectively than any propaganda, because it worked physically. Hadrian's Pantheon, with its 43-meter dome cast in concrete and unsupported by a single internal pillar, had no equal anywhere in the world. Trajan's Column, 38 meters high, carried an unbroken sculpted narrative of the Dacian Wars. Forums, baths, amphitheaters, All of them declared the same message: we build forever because we are forever. A person raised among such stone could hardly imagine that all of it might disappear. Stone was more persuasive than argument. The problem with the illusion of eternity was not simply that it was false. The deeper problem was that it blocked diagnosis. A system convinced of its own permanence does not search for structural vulnerabilities. It explains away every failure as a temporary deviation that will correct itself. Crop failure, temporary. Revolt on the frontier, temporary. Inflation, temporary. Each problem taken separately really was temporary, but temporary conditions accumulating over decades became a permanent reality, and no one wanted to call that reality by its true name. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus was writing in the 4th century when the empire was already splitting at the seams, when barbarians stood on the Danube, when provinces were being crushed by taxes, and still he wrote in the language of grandeur. He described symptoms with the precision of a first-rate observer, yet he could not step outside a conceptual world in which Rome, by definition, could not fall. This was not Ammianus's personal blindness. It was the blindness of a civilization that had built its identity on the thesis of its own eternity. That is why when destruction became serious, the first instinct was not reform, but denial. The illusion of eternity was not a psychological curiosity. It was a political mechanism that made timely adaptation nearly impossible. Rome believed in itself for too long and too absolutely. While the elite repeated the mantras of the eternal city, the army was already beginning to come apart from within, quietly, methodically, for reasons that had very little to do with barbarians across the river.
The overstretch of the army. The Roman army was not merely a military force, it was a state within the state. It built roads, founded cities, laid aqueducts, carried Latin and Roman law to the edges of the empire. Without the army, there would have been no provinces. Without provinces, no taxes. Without taxes, no army. The chain closed in on itself and worked, so long as every link held. Once one link began to weaken, the pressure shifted to all the others. Under Augustus, a legion contained roughly 5,000 heavy infantrymen, Roman citizens. Alongside them served auxiliary units drawn from the provinces, cavalry, and specialized detachments. The total strength of the army stood at around 300,000 men. A soldier served for 25 years, received regular pay, and at the end of service was granted either land or a cash payment. It was a professional, well-paid, disciplined force. It functioned because the state could afford it. The key word is could. The first signs of overstretch did not appear during barbarian invasions. They appeared earlier when conquests stopped. An army designed for expansion found itself in a fundamentally different role, not advance, but defense of an immense border. The empire's perimeter ran for more than 5,000 kilometers. Holding it required a constant military presence, not concentrated into a striking fist, but smeared thin along the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates frontier, and the North African limes. Threats emerged simultaneously in several places. To move legions from one front to another meant stripping the first one bare. The army ceased to be a fist, it became an extended line. The crisis of the 3rd century, from 235 to 284, exposed this contradiction in full. In 50 years, more than 20 emperors came and went. Most died violently. The army became the principal political actor. It raised emperors to the throne and tore them down again, sometimes within months. This was not moral decay in the troops. It was the logic of a system in which real power belonged to whoever controlled armed force, while legitimacy depended not on institutions, but on the loyalty of particular legions. Once the army turned to politics, it could no longer fully attend to its actual job. The frontiers felt that immediately. At the end of the 3rd century, Diocletian tried to solve the problem radically. He doubled the army, bringing it to perhaps 500,000 or 600,000 men. The logic was obvious. More soldiers meant better defense. But the economic logic ran in the opposite direction. Maintaining a doubled army required doubled expenditures. Taxes rose. The coinage was debased. Silver content in the denarius was cut so more money could be minted. Inflation accelerated. The real purchasing power of military pay declined. The army became more expensive and less effective at the same time. That is not a paradox. It is what happens when a structural problem is treated as though it were merely a matter of quantity. At the same time, the composition of the army changed. More and more soldiers were recruited from barbarian tribes, foederati, who fought under Roman banners while retaining their own chieftains and their own loyalties. Integration required time and resources. Both were running out. The army that was supposed to defend the empire increasingly consisted of men for whom the empire was not theirs in the way it had been for a legionary in the age of Augustus. The line between defender and threat began to blur, slowly, almost invisibly, but steadily. And while the military machine groaned under its own weight, the economy that was supposed to feed it was reaching its own limit. An economy at the edge. The Roman economy was never built on rising productivity. It was built on expansion. Military victories brought slaves. Slaves provided cheap labor. Labor created output. Output created taxes. Taxes funded the army. The army delivered new victories. It was a perfect circle, so long as it kept turning. Once the frontiers stabilized and the supply of new slaves dried up, the entire structure faced a problem for which it had no built-in solution. A machine designed around conquest collided with the end of conquest. Slave labor was not merely cheap, it actively discouraged technological development. Why improve the plow or invest in watermills when hundreds of slaves could grind grain by hand? Rome knew of many technical solutions that could have increased productivity, but it never implemented them systematically because the economic incentive was missing. Once slaves became scarcer and more expensive, a shift toward more efficient technology would have required capital and organization, and both were in short supply. The window for technological adaptation had been missed during the very period that looked like prosperity. It ranks among the most expensive lost opportunities in the history of the ancient economy. The monetary system began to degrade under Nero, who was the first to reduce the silver content of the denarius by roughly 10%. A small change, barely noticeable, but the precedent had been set. Every later ruler facing budget deficits reached for the same tool. By the middle of the 3rd century, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. It was, in effect, a copper coin washed in a thin silver coating. Merchants and landowners understood what this meant. They raised prices, demanded payment in kind, and shifted into barter. The money economy contracted. The state responded with taxes in kind and compulsory requisitions. The system became less flexible, less efficient, and far more brutal for those forced to support it. In AD 301, Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, one of the most detailed economic documents of antiquity. Maximum prices were set for hundreds of goods and services: wheat, beef, haircuts, even lines of poetry. The logic was simple enough: stop inflation through command methods. The result was equally predictable. Goods vanished from markets, trade went underground, shortages worsened. In practice, the edict had to be abandoned. It was a clear lesson in what happens when a state uses command methods to solve a problem rooted in structure. Apparently, it was a lesson no one truly learned. Agriculture declined slowly but steadily. Small free landowners were crushed by taxes and slid into dependence on the great estates. Out of that process emerged the colonist system. Peasants worked another man's land in exchange for protection and minimal subsistence. Productivity fell because the tenant had no incentive to work better. Any surplus went to the landlord.
The tax base narrowed because an impoverished tenant contributed less than an independent freeholder. The state lost revenue. Peasants lost freedom. The land lost owners. 3 processes advanced at once, each strengthening the other. By the 4th century, the Roman economy was consuming resources faster than it could reproduce them. The army cost more and protected less. The bureaucracy grew, but governed less effectively. Infrastructure aged and decayed. Each of these processes might have been manageable on its own. Together, they created pressure the system could no longer absorb. And against that backdrop, those who should have been seeking solutions were engaged in something quite different, securing their own position out of whatever still remained. The corruption of the elite. The word corruption needs qualification when applied to Rome. In the modern sense, corruption implies deviation from a norm. An official takes a bribe and breaks the rules. In the late Roman system, the bribe increasingly was the norm, not an exception to it. That distinction matters because deviations can be corrected. Norms can only be broken by breaking the system that produced them. The Roman elite of the 3rd and 4th centuries did not degenerate in the sense of becoming morally worse than earlier elites. They adapted rationally to conditions the system itself had created. The senatorial class lost real power slowly but steadily. Under Augustus, the Senate had already shifted from a governing body to a legitimizing one, ratifying decisions elsewhere. Under the military emperors of the 3rd century, it became stage scenery. The equestrian order, men of lesser birth but with money and connections, moved into key military and administrative positions. In itself, that was not disastrous. Meritocracy can work better than aristocracy. The problem lay elsewhere. Advancement depended less and less on competence and more on loyalty to a particular emperor or general. Results were barely measured. Loyalty was measured constantly. Provincial government declined according to the same logic. In theory, a provincial governor was supposed to maintain order, collect taxes, and protect the population. In practice, he was a temporary appointee who knew his term was limited and that his next post depended on political conditions at court. The incentive to invest in long-term administration was weak. The incentive to extract as much as possible while in office was very strong. Cicero had already described this mechanism in the Republic through the case of Verus plundering Sicily. 400 years later, nothing essential had changed. Only the scale and the degree of impunity had grown. The tax system became an instrument of enrichment at every level. A collector owed the treasury a fixed sum. Whatever he could squeeze out beyond that was his to keep. This created systemic pressure on a population that had no real means of defense. In theory, one could appeal to a higher official. In practice, that higher official belonged to the same system and operated under the same incentives. This web of mutual protection was not a conspiracy. It was the institutional logic of a world in which personal enrichment and public duty pointed in opposite directions, and the first almost always won. The army, as a political actor, produced a particular form of corruption, the donativum. Every new emperor paid a special bonus to the soldiers, not out of generosity, but necessity. Without that payment, the legions might refuse to recognize him or back a rival. These donatives came from a treasury already under strain. When the treasury ran dry, the coinage was debased. Inflation then eroded the value of the next donative, which had to be made larger. The spiral tightened, and each turn made the system less stable. This was not corruption in the everyday sense. It was corruption built into the mechanism of power itself. The corruption of the Roman elite was not the cause of the empire's fall, in the sense that without it, everything would have been different. It was a symptom, a sign that institutions had lost the ability to align private interest with public good. Once that happens, the system begins to work against itself. Each participant behaves rationally from a personal point of view and destructively from the point of view of the whole. That is exactly what happened in late Rome. And while the upper layers were rotting, another process unfolded alongside it, less visible but just as dangerous. The Romans were gradually ceasing to be Roman. the loss of civic identity. In AD 212, Caracalla's edict granted Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire. Legally, it was an act of enormous scale. Millions of people from Britain to Mesopotamia received a status that had once been a privilege, a badge of pride, and a concrete set of rights. In terms of identity, however, the act blurred that very identity. Roman citizenship ceased to be something one struggled for, transmitted to one's children as a value, or used to distinguish oneself from others. It became an administrative category. And whatever becomes an administrative category stops serving as the basis of collective loyalty. Roman identity in the Republican and early imperial period rested on concrete practices, Latin as the language of public life, law, and administration, participation in urban self-government, local councils, magistracies, civic offices, military service as a civic duty, public cults and civic festivals as collective rituals. All of this created not an abstract membership in a great civilization, but an everyday practice through which a person reproduced his Romanness. Once that practice began to break down, identity remained only as an empty shell. Urban self-government decayed under tax pressure. Membership in a city council, the decurionate, turned from privilege into burden. Decurions were personally responsible for tax collection. If the population failed to pay, the shortfall came out of their own pockets. By the 4th century, people were fleeing the office. They surrendered property, entered the army, joined the church, anything to avoid being trapped in the city council. The state responded with laws forbidding decurions to leave their class, but forced retention in a civic role is no longer citizenship, it is obligation. The difference between those two words lies in the direction of movement, toward the system or away from it. Christianity altered the nature of collective identity in a fundamental way. This is not a value judgment, it is an observation about mechanics. Classical Roman religion was civic. The gods were patrons of the city, the state, specific places, and public functions. Participation in cult was an act of civic loyalty. Christianity offered a different framework. Belonging to the community of believers mattered more than belonging to the political body.
The heavenly Jerusalem mattered more than earthly Rome. This did not automatically make Christians bad citizens, but it did create a competing identity that, at moments of choice, could prove stronger than the civic one. And the weaker the state became, the more often such moments arrived. Latin retained its position longer than the other elements of Roman identity, but even it gradually gave way in everyday provincial life to regional speech. In the East, Greek had never really yielded to Latin in the first place. In the West, the gap between written norm and spoken language widened year by year. This was not a catastrophe in itself, but it was an indicator that the empire's shared cultural space was fragmenting into regional subcultures tied together by less and less common content. People still called themselves Roman, but the meaning of that word was changing from active belonging to passive designation, from something you did to something written on a document. The loss of civic identity did not kill the empire directly. It killed the willingness to defend it. Millions of people who had once reproduced Rome in the routines of everyday life began to reproduce something else, and the structure lost its foundation. Not its armies, not its money, not its territories, its foundation. And at exactly that moment, what looked from the outside like a barbarian threat turned out, on closer examination, to be something rather different.
This fate is behind you. Enter the next story.